No.
All right. I don't have a, now, here we go. All right, good morning. You're not going to have Heather today, you're going to have Lou Wallace. So as we open up this meeting today, I've got a few things I need to read to you concerning being in this building. So thank you all for coming today and adhere to the rules that I'm going to read to you. Attendees may not erect any signage inside or outside the meeting room or of this building. Attendees are not entitled to be disorderly or disruptive of the meeting from proceeding in an orderly, efficient, effective fashion. Disruptive behavior may result in a recess or removal from the meeting. Possession or use of any device that may disrupt the conduct of business is prohibited, including, but not limited to, voice amplification equipment, bullhorns, blowhorns, sirens, and other noise-producing devices, as well as signs on sticks, poles, or stakes, or helium-filled balloons. All attendees are asked to be very respectful of all speakers. Rules will be enforced fairly and impartially, not only to ensure the efficient and effective conduct of business, but also to ensure no interference with the business of, of this complex, its employees, and guests. Attendees wishing to record the proceedings are welcome to do so. However, you may not interfere with the business of the meeting, nor impede the view or participation of other meeting attendees and staff. No smoking is allowed unless in a designated outside space. This includes tobacco and e-cigarettes. No alcohol, fireworks, pyrotechnics, weapons, or any substances, items controlled by law are allowed. No firearms are allowed in the state's contracted spaces except for firearms carried by law enforcement officers or authorized security personnel. All violators may be subject to removal from the meeting facility. Anyone removed from the facility may not re-enter. Anyone who fails to comply with removal may be charged with trespass. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, we will work on our agenda items, and I'm going to have an introduction before we do that. Excuse me, I was about to forget. We have some new members and some young members and a couple of old members. So at this time, I'll start to my left and introduce yourself and come across the diocese, please.
Good morning. I'm Scott Cameron, new member, I think about 3 months tenure.
Good morning. This is Jill Cohen. I'm coming to you from Falls Church, Virginia.
And again, I'm Lou Wallace from Virginia's great Southwest.
Robert Dunn, and I'm from Chester, Virginia.
Jerry Kilgore grew up in Virginia's great Southwest and now in Henrico County. New member.
Mike Roll. Mike Rollband, I'm Director of DEQ.
Good morning, Mike Jagels from the Office of Attorney General.
Thank you very much. So at this time, I will ask for a motion to approve the minutes from the June 22nd, 22 meeting.
So move.
Okay, I have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? And I'm an abstention. I was not in this meeting. Thank you very much. Next one, we're going to move on to tab B, is the proposed local and regional water supply planning. Porterfield, please.
Good morning. It's actually an errata sheet that is enclosed in your board book. and it's an errata sheet for the proposed amendments to the local and regional water supply planning regulation that was presented to you at the June 22nd, 2022 meeting. Next slide, please. So after further review, the June 22nd, 2022 proposed amendments were inconsistent with statute. So there were some changes that were included in there that should not have been made. For example, not revising the definition of board. Board means, it's going to continue to mean the State Water Control Board, and we are changing the term department back to board in the proposal in the regulatory text where appropriate. So you have the errata sheet in your board book, but essentially we are not proposing to make changes that we were initially thought we needed to make changes to. And that's because the water supply planning requirements are found in Chapter 3.2, the Conservation of Water Resources, the State Water Control Board, and Chapter 3.2 of the Title 62.1 of the Code of Virginia was not revised by Chapter 356 of the 2022 Acts of Assembly. So we're just asking for this correction before we move forward with the proposed stage.
Okay.
Okay. Next slide. Is there any questions?
Does the board have any questions concerning Ms. Porterfield's?
Okay.
So at this time, we need a motion to
You need a let me-
accept.
The recommendation.
The
Can I have the next
recommendation.
slide, please? So staff recommends that the board approve the edits identified on the errata sheet for the local and regional water supply planning regulation, 9 VAC 25-780, in addition to the amendments previously authorized for public comment at the June 22nd, 2022 State Water Control Board meeting.
Okay, I'll accept a motion from the
I'll
board.
move that motion.
Okay, I have a motion.
Second.
I have a second. Any further discussion? I'll call for the vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, moving through. Final exempt, revisions in response to 356 of the Acts of the Assembly. Ms. Davenport.
Madam Chairman, members of the board, good morning. I'm going to be giving a brief overview of tabs C through K, which is the bulk of the paper that's in your board book. Do I have control of this, or do you guys? Okay, gotcha, thank you. So I will be presenting final exempt amendments to a number of your regulations in response to Chapter 356 of the 2022 Acts of the Assembly. Next, please. The process that we are using and the amendments I'm proposing this morning follow the final exempt process. The Administrative Process Act allows for an expedited process if certain criteria are met, and the criteria that we will be using here is a regulation may be exempt from full process if it's necessary to conform to changes in Virginia statutory law or the Appropriation Act where no agency discretion is involved. Next, please. For those of you who were here at the June meeting, you can recall that Angie Jenkins, Director of Policy, talked a little bit generally about Senate Bill 657, which has been codified as Acts of Assembly Chapter 356, and it relates to the State Water Control Board and a transfer of authority to the Department of Environmental Quality. Angie explained that the legislation limits the authority of the State Water Control Board to the issuance of regulations and transfers the board's existing authority to issue permits and orders to the Department of Environmental Quality. As you can see, it addresses chapters 3.1, 24, and 25, and that goes back to what Melissa just presented, which that statute did not change 3.2. Next slide, please. The bill in a really macro sense, changes the definition with respect to the development of everything but regulations. So in a really broad sense, the bill says any time where any existing regulation or statute talks about the board, it really is defined as the Department of Environmental Quality, except for instances when it relates to the development and promulgation of regulations. There's additional changes that go along, which we'll talk about further, that relate to the processing of controversial permits, the board's role in an ability to speak to us about a pending controversial permit, a requirement for a second public hearing, which will be held by the staff to present response to comments and then make sure that we'll take public comment to make sure we actually capture the response to comments and the comments accurately. But the way we've tried to organize this is, first of all, this was a huge, huge work effort. Staff had to read through every single regulation and figure out, should it stay board or does it become the department? And when we first started talking about this, we contemplated just making that definitional change, but we were concerned as time went on, and maybe I retired or Angie retired or other folks retired, that it would be really, really confusing if you had this definitional change, but then you still had board and departments scattered throughout the regulations. So we wanted to make sure that we implemented the proper language in every regulation. Our goal is to make what we're calling comprehensive amendments, which I'll talk about, which is the full scope of 657, to all base permit regulations, because they relate, the bill relates primarily to permitting. We also made comprehensive amendments to certain other chapters to the extent that we had the manpower to get through it. And for everything that we could not get to, we made a change to just incorporate that definitional change and delegation of authority. And our intent is that those chapters, those regs will come up for reissuance at a future point, and at that point we'll scrub through and change department and board. So again, it's a lot of paper. Hopefully what we've done makes sense. And what I'm going to do is just quickly present those sections that either got the comprehensive amendments or just the definitional change. Next slide, please. So the base permit regulations, which tell us how we process permits, were revised to include all of the required amendments from Senate Bill 657. And that includes a requirement for DEQ to include a permit rationale, to include the criteria for requesting and granting a public hearing on an individual permit action, a definition of controversial permit, which really doesn't have significant bearing with the State Water Control Board because the definition is not changed. It's the same threshold of requests for a public hearing, and nothing changes in the air world. That's a little bit different. What we're calling controversial permit reporting, which is that if we are processing at DEQ a controversial permit, we will report to the board at the appropriate meeting what's going on with that permit. And then there was the revision to definitions and a number of citations. So we did that to the base permit regs, the VIPDES regs, the pollution abatement permit reg, the water protection permit reg, the surface water management area reg, and the groundwater withdrawal regulations. Next, please. We had the staff resources to also make those comprehensive changes to a number of other regulations, and it's all of the tank-related regulations. As you probably remember, it is an historical artifact that you, the State Water Control Board, owns the tank regulations, even though they're not administered by the water divisions, they're over in the land division. But all of the petroleum and above-ground storage tank and financial responsibility regulation, all of those are presented as having all of the changes made. Next, please. We also had the staff available to go into the Virginia Water Protection General Permit Regulations. Unlike the VIPD's general permits, those have a 10-year lifespan, and Brenda was able to make all the changes in accordance with the statute in those permits. Next, please. And then we went ahead and made the changes to the erosion and sediment control regulation. Also, the certification regulation, which sets out certifications that E&S inspectors and plan reviewers and such have to have. Next, please. We were able to follow through and make the comprehensive amendments to the groundwater standards. Next. And you know, it's interesting, it was sort of like the fewer instances of board, the easier it was to get through the regulation, which makes a lot of sense. And then there were a number of other chapters in addition to those GPs and the base regulations where it was not a huge lift to make the changes there in tab K, and it's permit fees, just a whole host of assorted regulations. Next, please. Local and regional water supply, tab K. Next, please. And then tab D are those regulations where we simply made the change to the definitional authority, and we'll scrub those regulations for board versus department as we bring those regulations up. And it's a lot of the other general permits. Next, please. Again, that's a continuing list of general permits in tab D. Next, please. Again, bigger type just because there's fewer words on the page. Again, tab D, those more additional VIPD's general permits. And then, next please, the general permit for, the general VPA permit for poultry waste management. Next please. Amendments to definitions and delegation of authority, tab K, you'll find other regulations, the water quality standards. Again, the statute doesn't make significant changes to anything other than permitting responsibility, but we just wanted to clean up a lot of this regulatory language. And then final slide, please, is the staff recommendation. I hope there's a way, Madam Chairman, that I don't have to read every one of these regulatory citations, but if you feel I need to, I certainly will.
I don't think so.
Thank you very much. So the staff recommends that the board adopt the amendments to all of these regulations that are set out in the staff recommendation and affirm that it will receive, consider, and respond to petitions by any person at any time with respect to reconsideration or revision of the regulation as provided by the Administrative Process Act.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I move that we dispense with the reading of all these amendments and move them in a block for approval.
We have a motion on the table.
I'll second that.
Got a second. Any discussion? Hearing none, I'll call for the vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Looks like you have a motion that carries.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to have to turn the page. We worked our way through a lot of that agenda, right? 2 pages. We're over on 3. All right. Final regulation in tab, have I skipped anything? In tab I, is that right where we are? L. Oh, it is L. My glasses need changing. I apologize. Tab L.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the board. I am Allison Thompson, the Water Permits Technical Reviewer in the Northern Regional Office, and today I'm here for the General VIPD's Permit Regulation for discharges from petroleum-contaminated sites, groundwater remediation, and hydrostatic tests. Next slide, please. This regulation had its NOIRA published in September 28th of 2020. We received no comments then. The Technical Advisory Committee met in person on December 1st of 2021, and on March 25th, 2022, the State Water Control Board authorized us to move forward with public comment and the public hearing. The public hearing was held on June 2nd, 2022. We received no comments at the hearing, but during the public comment period, we did receive 3 sets of comments, and there are approximately 34 active permits statewide, with probably the majority of them in the Northern Virginia area. Next slide, please. Comments received during public notice. We received 1 comment from EPA noting that the general permit change of ownership provision is not consistent with the VIPTES regulation. And this was a change that was first implemented in 2013 with the concrete general permit and has been done with the general permit since then. And it was a comment, not an objection, and it was done because it eases the burden of administering the general permit for the regional staff. The second comment was received from Dewberry, and they asked for clarification between this general permit and the construction general permit, and the allowance for groundwater to be discharged under the construction general permit. And this will be something that we clarify in the guidance document for staff so that it is clear what can be covered under this GP versus the construction general permit. The final comments received were from Wild Virginia, and they provided 3 comments. Their first comment was that too many activities are covered under this general permit. And this general permit addresses several categories and subcategories of discharges. And the regulation, the VIPTES regulation, does allow for 1 or more categories and subcategories of discharges within a geographical area. And we feel that this permit is appropriate. These activities have been covered under this general permit before, and it further addresses that the limits and monitoring requirements for the discharges associated with dewatering and contamination of metals were added, and this discharge is also sufficiently similar to meet the applicable general permit criteria. The second was that the anti-degradation is not protected, and this general permit does authorize petroleum and hydrocarbon contaminated sites, as well as groundwater collected in building sumps and hydrostatic testing of pipelines and tanks. The discharges under the first category involve remediation from contaminated from leaking USTs, and in some cases, the leaks have already reached to the receiving stream, and these sites are most often in the developed areas where stream quality has already been adversely impacted due to development, and the receiving stream would be considered Tier 1. The permit does, under authorization to discharge, note that if the discharge would violate or could violate the anti-dig policy, that the permittee would not be eligible for the general permit, and thus the staff would let the permittee know that they would have to apply for coverage under an individual permit so that we could protect the Tier 2 water body. And finally, he noted that the narrative criteria was violated by this permit, and we felt, pardon me, I didn't find my notes, that we felt that the narrative criteria are all met. The water quality criteria do allow for dilution. We did not allow for any dilution, and therefore they meet standards at end of pipe, and we felt that there was no likelihood of any violations occurring with this general permit. Next slide. The significant changes proposed, we are revising the title of the regulation to note that we are allowing dewatering activities of contaminated sites, so we clarified that in the title. The purpose of the general permit was expanded to include remediation of groundwater from metals contamination and also allow ongoing dewatering projects. We revised the permit term. We have clarified that ongoing dewatering projects may require additional coordination, permitting, and/or reporting for permittees. Next slide. We've updated the necessary items on the registration statement. We've revised analytical methodology as appropriate, and we've revised limitations in accordance with the updated water quality standards. And we added the section to address the metals contamination, and they included a number of metals: arsenic, cadmium, chromium, copper, lead, nickel, selenium, silver, thallium, and zinc. Next slide. Are there any questions before I proceed to staff's recommendation?
Any questions from the board?
I have a question, Madam Chair. Just wondering if you could walk me through the response to the comment from Jennifer Fulton of EPA with regard to 40 CFR 122.61, why you chose not to be consistent with that regulation?
I'm trying to remember. It goes back to 2013 with the concrete general permit. I was not involved with that original decision. Alan, do you?
Good morning. Alan Broke, I'm manager of the Office of VIPTES Permits. So we have that provision in our overall VIPTES reg, which is consistent with the federal reg, that you provide notification 30 days in advance of a property transfer and you get automatic coverage. We found as a practical matter that was almost never met. The environmental staff didn't know of the real estate deal, the closing dates. As a practical matter, it was just never, ever met. So starting back in 2013, we changed that in our individual rulemakings for the general permits to give a little more leeway so that the new owner is automatically covered without the advance notice that was in the overall reg.
So they still have to do it within 30 days. It's just whether the 30 days is prior to the transfer or after the transfer?
Correct.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any further questions?
All right, then DEQ's staff recommendation is that we recommend the board adopt the amendments to the Virginia Pollutant Discharge Elimination System General Permit for groundwater remediation of contaminated sites, dewatering activities of contaminated sites, and hydrostatic tests, 9 VAC 25-120, as amended and presented to you today. And 2, staff also recommends that the board affirm that it will receive, consider, and respond to petitions by any person at any time with respect to reconsideration or revision of this regulation as provided by the Administrative Process Act.
Thank you. I'll entertain a motion for staff recommendations.
I so move, Madam Chairman.
I have a motion. I need a second.
Second.
Got a second. Any further discussion? I'm assuming not, but I'll ask for that. Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries. Thank you. Okay, moving on to tab M in your board book. This is water quality standards, the triennial review rulemaking to adopt new, update, and cancel existing water quality standards. Ms. Thomas. Or
Good
Mr.
morning.
Thomas. Sorry.
Madam Chair, members of the board, good morning. My name is Bryant Thomas. I'm the director of our Office of Ecology. I'm here to present to you today our triennial review of the water quality standards regulation and a request for final adoption of the amendments. Next slide, please. For my presentation today, just to kind of give you an outline, providing some background and overview of the triennial review development process. I'm going to highlight some key amendments of the regulation and spend some time discussing public comments received and staff responses, as well as addressing questions you may have. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
To get closer.
Yes, I was going to ask the same thing. Thank you.
I can step to the podium a little closer as well. Yep, that works for me. Thanks.
Yes.
Can you hear better? Okay. So the triennial review of the Virginia Water Quality Standards, that is better. I can hear it much louder as well. It's required by both federal and state law for the periodic review and update of the standards regulations every 3 years. The periodic review allows us to incorporate new information into the standards, and we last completed our triennial review update in July of 2017. We initiated the current triennial review process in 2021. Next slide, please. The NORIA for this triennial review was issued in March of 2021. We formed a regulatory advisory panel, or a RAP. That RAP met 4 times in the spring, late spring of 2021. And we received approval from the board to move forward with the proposed amendments at your September 2021 meeting. The public comment period for the proposed amendments was held between January and March, January 17 and March 18 earlier this year. 2 hearings were held, one at the end of February in Richmond and one on March 1st in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And we received a number of public comments from different individuals and groups. Next slide, please. I mentioned that we formed a RAP to work with us on development of these amendments. This lists the various organizations represented on the RAP, and as you can see, there was a diverse group of stakeholders. We had a lot of good conversations, very productive conversations. Next slide, please. So the triennial review is the rulemaking where we update the regulation based on new science, new information that we may have, which is often coming from EPA at the federal level, identify issues that may be raised by agency staff and or the public. We use this rulemaking to update the criteria, use designations, and to do housekeeping of the regulation via miscellaneous updates and clarifications. Next slide, please. The key amendments that I'll touch base on here, but I really won't spend much time going through these. They're detailed in your board book and we've talked about it at the September meeting. But as you can see, they concern the table of parameters, where we have a table of toxic parameters and the established criteria with those, as well as the Chesapeake Bay criteria. Next slide, please. And they also pertain to the nutrients for lakes and our special standards. This last bullet on here, the new filamentous algae criteria for specific sections of the Shenandoah River. I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes in the conversation of comments received and staff responses. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the comment period was held from mid-January through mid-March of this year. We received comments from 37 individuals or groups, including those listed on the slide. Next slide, please. The main areas of comments received, and I want to spend a little time on all of these, but on the proposed amendments themselves, primarily focusing on the copper BLM, or a biotic ligand model. The proposed amendments associated with the copper BLM, as well as the Shenandoah algae criteria. We've received additional comments as well on a number of other topics and or pollutants that may be addressed. And I would note that in general, the comments that we received reflect the areas where the RAP, during our discussion, and RAP members still had some comments and or concerns at the end of that process. And while we did not receive full consensus on all topics during our RAP discussions, we feel the amendments before you today included in the rulemaking are appropriate, considering the balance and the wide range of opinions and input that was offered. Next slide, please. Copper BLM. Spend a little time on this. So first of all, the copper BLM, a biotic ligand model. That's the BLM. It's a model, and its approach to predict the toxicity of copper, in this case we're talking copper, and this is freshwater, but the toxicity of copper on aquatic organisms. And so the BLM is, it's a model that uses a number of input parameters, a number of water quality input parameters to predict copper toxicity. The comments that we received concerning the BLM were technical in nature, first, in that the BLM is not necessary. It's the existing hardness-based approach of our standards would be fully protective of aquatic life, and arguably that the existing hardness-based approach are a more accurate measure of protective levels of criteria. There are also cost concerns expressed that past investments in site-specific studies and the possible additional, arguably unnecessary additional treatment would impose additional burdens and costs, and those past studies that might have been done, site-specific studies, would become obsolete. And they were also concerned with implementation, that the adoption of the BLM would make permitting more difficult and compliance with permits more expensive. Next slide, please. In response, I would say, first of all, that DEQ, we are supportive of the science behind the BLM as a versatile tool for predicting copper toxicity. However, we feel that it's premature to move forward with the language as initially contained in the proposed amendments, which is transitioning away from the current hardness-based criteria and implementing the BLM approach. And while we are supportive of the science of this, there remain some uncertainties that are cause for concern. And those uncertainties pertain to a number of things. First of all, there is limited guidance from EPA for implementing the copper BLM, specifically in the context of permitting. We found that the BLM approach is very complex. It's a model, and it's a black box of a model. The model is currently it's proprietary software, and it's difficult to understand the computations of that model. They're very complicated, and staff, it would really is challenged to try and replicate those calculations. And because of the current status of the uncertainties with the permitting guidance, the nature of the BLM model, and the complexity of it, to be able to truly understand it amongst ourselves as well as communicating that with the stakeholders, we are at this time proposing to stick with the criteria and the standards language that we currently have, basically retaining the existing language, holding off on moving forward with transitioning to the BLM till there's additional information and additional guidance on the BLM, and basically keeping what we have currently in the regulation. And it's worth noting that the regulation does provide, if you're going to do a site-specific study, there are two options that the regulation does currently allow. One is our hardness-based approach. One is allowing for a BLM study. And so that is in the regulation. We want to retain that. We just think it's premature at this time to move forward with fully transitioning in. Next slide, please. The next element of the proposed criteria to spend some time talking through and sharing is regarding the Shenandoah algae criteria. I'm not going to read through the slide. The slide presents the criteria and is contained in the board book. I would just point out that the criteria do apply to specific sections of the Shenandoah, the North Fork Shenandoah and South Fork Shenandoah, and there are two criteria associated, a 2-month median and a seasonal median. Next slide, please. So we did receive a number of comments on the criteria amendments, the Shenandoah algae criteria amendments. And while there was general support for the criteria, there were concerns from I'll say, differing perspectives from both sides of the equation. Some thinking that the criteria are too restrictive and too broadly applied, Conversely, some thinking that the criteria as proposed are a good start, but not adequately protective and should be applied more broadly. Some of the specific concerns were the lack of scientific support for the criteria as proposed, especially the shorter season or the seasonal threshold. There was concern that the 2-month median is overly conservative. Conversely, there was concern that the 2-month median should be changed to a maximum value. As well, concerns were raised with balancing costs and benefits to achieve the regulatory goal, that being protection of the recreational use. We received comments to replace the current allowable exceedance frequency in the regulation, which is 1 in 3 years exceedance, to 2 in 6 years. Received comment that the criteria should be applied to all freshwaters in Virginia. And as well, we received comments that expressing concerns with the monitoring and implementation programs. Next slide, please. In response, the averaging periods and the frequency of exceedance were selected by staff to identify persistent recreational losses. And that's one of the things that these criteria are aiming to do. Identify where we have persistence, nuisance, algae problems. The proposed criteria allowed no more than 1 recreation season in 3 years to exceed the thresholds for benthic chlorophyll A. And it's our position that 1 recreation season is insufficient for determining that a water body has experienced a persistence nuisance. Rather, we would maintain that a recurring pattern of recreational impairment must be documented before determination of use non-attainment or use impairment is made. And a 3-year interval prevents a water body from having recreational losses due to nuisance filamentous algae in consecutive years. Additionally, we would note that the criteria consider both recreational and aesthetic qualities in their time frames and the frequency and duration of exceedances that are proposed. The aesthetics of a stream, we would suggest, are best characterized by evaluating long-term conditions over the recreation season, whereas the loss of recreational use is viewed as more of an acute issue on the shorter 2-month median. Additionally, the criteria apply to those sections where there is sufficient monitoring data to verify that the proposed thresholds are appropriate. Over time, and staff, you will see that we are measured and deliberate in the proposed criteria that we're bringing before you today. And we feel that we have enough data information that the proposed sections for the criteria are appropriate. In the future, as additional information may become available, different thresholds may possibly be recommended for other water bodies. And lastly, I would note that the implementation associated with the algal programs and algae monitoring includes ongoing monitoring of nuisance sites, as well as complaint response monitoring that we do in conjunction with and coordination with the Virginia Department of Health. Next slide, please. Moving into additional comments, not specifically on the proposed amendments, but the comments that we did receive and want to talk through and share with you. First concerns cyanotoxins or harmful algal blooms. Sometimes blue-green algae is the term. We received the comment that DEQ should adopt EPA's recommended cyanotoxin criteria for the protection of human health. In response, we would note that states have the discretion to adopt EPA's nationally recommended recreational cyanotoxin thresholds. And that discretion is to adopt them as either water quality criteria or swimming advisory levels. And in Virginia, we use EPA's recommended thresholds for swimming advisories, and those advisories are issued through the Virginia Department of Health. We work with EDH, and we do consider those advisories that are issued in our assessment process when we're assessing recreational uses. So we are consistent with EPA's guidelines concerning the recommended recreational cyanotoxin thresholds. Next slide, please. We received comments on the narrative criteria, specifically to amend the water quality standards to specify that all parts of the narrative criteria must be fully implemented and enforced. The narrative criteria are descriptive and they are goal-oriented. They do not establish specific numeric criteria or endpoints. And we would note that the narrative criteria are regularly applied and implemented in our agency programs, including our water quality monitoring and assessment program, our permitting program. You heard Ms. Thompson just a few minutes ago discuss the narrative criteria pertaining to the general permit, our pollution response programs as well. And it is common practice that policies and procedures established to implement regulation be developed and implemented outside of the regulatory framework. This allows programmatic flexibility to implement the regulation while providing for public input in the process of establishing implementation guidance. Next slide, please. We received comments on turbidity in solids and nutrients. Specifically, a request for the board to direct DEQ to initiate and/or expedite regulatory processes to develop appropriate numeric criteria for turbidity and/or solids and nutrients, and also suggesting the adoption of chlorophyll criteria for all tidal waters of the Chesapeake Bay. In response, at the direction of the board, DEQ did initiate rulemaking to develop numeric turbidity criteria in April of 2021. That process was initiated, but staff has not had the capacity to return to this rulemaking. And I would note that Virginia relies on the implementation measures and control strategies from our existing programs and regulations to address nutrients. Specifically, we could point to the nutrient criteria for lakes and reservoirs and the monitoring and assessment to implement those criteria. We have criteria for protecting the Chesapeake Bay from impacts of nutrients and sediment. We have the Bay TMDL and its associated watershed implementation plans that direct activities addressing nutrients. And we also have monitoring and assessment in water bodies throughout the Commonwealth, where if impairments are identified and nutrients identified as concern, we develop local nutrients and/or sediment TMDLs. Lastly, regarding the adoption of chlorophyll criteria for all waters, we would note that Virginia continues to work with the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership on the development of chlorophyll A thresholds that would allow the implementation of narrative criteria, because we do have narrative chlorophyll A criteria in our regulations, but working with the Bay Partnership to develop thresholds that would be used in the assessment process to allow us to implement those chlorophyll A criteria, or the chlorophyll A narrative criteria. Next slide, please. PFAS, the per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. We received a request to have the board direct DEQ to initiate and/or expedite regulatory processes to develop appropriate numeric criteria for PFAS. In response, the science of the PFAS, PFOS, PFOA, these large number of chemicals in this family or category of chemicals is still very much emerging. I think we've all seen a lot of it in different news and publications recently. And EPA is in the process of developing water quality criteria for PFAS compounds, both for aquatic life and human health. So the process for incorporating criteria normally, and I mentioned earlier, much of our triennial review and our updates of our regulations comes down from recommendations at the federal level from EPA after they've done research and the epidemiological studies and understanding the deriving at recommended criteria. So EPA does have a roadmap that they are implementing and following concerning the development of criteria for PFAS compounds. And lastly, I would note that there is a Virginia PFAS work group that is conducting research that may lead to recommended maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs, for drinking water for inclusion in the VDH, or the Virginia Department of Health regulations. Next slide, please. There are some changes between the proposed and final amendments, and I'll go through those, share those with you now. First is the addition of language to the proposed freshwater aluminum criteria that specifies the criteria are expressed as total recoverable, the form of the metal. Retaining the current CAS number of 57749 for chloridane, since this corresponds to a different mixture than that described by CAS number 127899036, initially proposed for adoption. Additionally, revision of the language for the proposed nuisance filamentous algae thresholds to make it clear that a determination of nuisance filamentous algae impeding the recreation use will be made when exceedances of either of the specified thresholds have occurred in more than one recreation season in 3 years. Next slide, please. Additionally, remove the proposed language stipulating the freshwater copper biotic ligand model is to be used to develop criteria when the board determines there is a sufficient data set of input parameters, and retain the existing language of the criteria that provides use of the BLM as an option for site-specific criteria derivation. Next slide, please. And lastly, since changes were made to the proposed text in response to the public comment, the amendments are being forwarded to the Office of the Attorney General for agency statutory authority. And next slide. Be happy to entertain questions if you may have any.
Any questions from the board?
Yes, I do, Madam Chairman, thank you. Brian, first of all, thanks very much for that very thorough presentation. I've got, I guess, a question about the filamentous algae criteria. So I understand that it's really a human health criterion as opposed to aquatic life criterion, but the belief is that there's a correlation there, and that if the human health criterion is met, the aquatic life is okay. Once upon a time, I worked in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I remember that what works for a channel catfish doesn't necessarily work for a striped bass, and almost certainly doesn't work for a brook trout. So, I'm wondering, to the extent we plan on coordinating with the Department of Wildlife to validate, the assumption that the human health criterion works for, various, aquatic species of interest.
That's a great question. A few things, thoughts. DWR was part of our RAP and participated in the process. So they have been an active participant and familiar with the proposed criteria. And also, the criteria as proposed, you're correct, they're not intended for protection of aquatic life. And it's human health from a perspective of recreation and protecting the recreation use. So these are filamentous green algae that we're talking about here. And we talk a lot and we hear a lot about harmful algae, and one of our comments was on cyanotoxins and harmful algae. It's a separate issue. It's all algae, it's all green stuff, right? But it's a separate issue from the filamentous nuisance algae that we're proposing for our criteria here. And so we're looking at that aspect of the recreation use and protecting it. And I would note, I lost my train of thought for a minute there, so I want to come back to this. But I guess on the filamentous algae and the protection of aquatic life, we did look at the available monitoring data we have to see and ensure that the adoption of the criteria that we are proposing here do not preclude attainment of aquatic life. Like at these levels of benthic chlorophyll A, are we seeing impairments of aquatic life at those levels. And we don't see that. So we do not see that these criteria are precluding attainment of the aquatic life use.
Thank you. I do have one more point, but I'll let others talk first if there's any other questions.
Any more questions from the board?
I had a question, Madam Chair. It's also about the filamentous algae. I was just wondering if you could clarify, there's a process, I gather, for citizens to report or make complaints. Is DEQ also doing monitoring as well for the filamentous algae? Can you just clarify the triggers and the monitoring?
Yeah, another great question. Thank you. There's a lot going on behind the scenes and in the development of the criteria that we bring before you today. Particularly for the filamentous algae, it goes back 10 years plus on the development of, first of all, identifying the concern, and then the development of methods that would give us defensible, reliable, quantifiable results to characterize the issue. And because it's quantifiable, we're looking at benthic chlorophyll A. We've arrived at a point that we feel that we're very comfortable with these criteria as proposed. The development of these criteria entail a number of years of monitoring, particularly between the 2016 and 19 period, where settling on methodology and field methods for sampling and sample collection, and then collecting data to allow us to have confidence in the numbers we bring before you today. The monitoring is ongoing at these locations. We have, I'll call them nuisance sites, where our Valley Regional Office regularly conducts monitoring through the recreation season for these nuisance sites. We also have a complaint-driven monitoring and response system. And the complaints are I guess, reported, if you will, through an online portal. The Department of Health maintains this portal because they are often reported as suspected harmful algal. You can see the green stuff in the river, not sure what it is, so you can report it. It goes to the online reporting portal. That information comes to VDH and DEQ staff, and then we will respond looking at what the nature of the complaint, where it's located, and responses may entail field visits, often do, and then field visits may entail sampling depending on what our field staff observe when they arrive. So one of the comments we did receive is that there's concern that our monitoring is response-driven and not proactive surveillance. And in that, we are not staffed or geared and to have an active HAB surveillance monitoring program. But being able to provide response monitoring is a good way to identify, well, prioritize available resources and then identify where best to do our monitoring. And it allows us to collect information and data that we can maintain and evaluate into the future as well.
So at the risk of sounding obtuse, I gathered, though, that you do some monitoring. There's still going to be some ongoing monitoring.
For the nuisance sites, we're doing monthly monitoring at those locations, yeah. And there are 6 locations, North and South Fork watersheds, that we have ongoing monthly monitoring sites.
A follow-up, if I may. So you're measuring benthic chlorophyll A, not chlorophyll A in the water column or in the surface. Can you walk me through why that decision was made?
Yes. So oftentimes when we're looking at this, and this is a free-flowing riverine system, and when we're looking at this, and part of the initial concerns, complaints that we received were these filamentous green mats that you would see attached to the substrate, right? And those becoming thick and green. Sometimes they break off and they can become mats on the solids, but more often than not, they're attached to the substrate. And when they get to a certain density, it becomes a problem. But having the sampling of that substrate material, that benthic material, is really where we were targeting, because that's really primarily where the concerns were raised. And I mentioned establishing a methodology to have defensible, quantifiable, repeatable results. And a lot of that is based on And I won't go into the details of the methodology, but developing that methodology and really focusing on that benthic substrate, because that's where the problems have generally arisen. When we look at the water column in chlorophyll A in these systems normally, in my experience, we're not seeing large numbers in the water column itself, right? And so you wouldn't necessarily trigger. I mean, if you're looking at the productivity of the system, you could see it. But normally in our reservoirs and more still water, are my observations more so than in moving waters. And I'm going to pause right there because I don't have all the history of this, but if there's my team of water quality standards professionals is with me. And they have more of a history of how we arrived at where we are. So I'm going to see if they have anything they want to add. Tish is here. Good.
Hi, I'm Tish Robertson. He gave a great answer, but I just wanted to add that we see these mats extending within the water column. It's not that they're just flat, right? So when we go and harvest the algae, we're kind of grabbing all of it when it's filling the water column, and that represents kind of both dimensions of the nuisance, not just the coverage, but also the fill. So we're getting water column, it's just not phytoplankton.
I appreciate that clarification. Thank you.
Okay, so I do have, I guess, another question. I'm in another life, I was very familiar with the problems caused by blue-green algae, most especially in Florida. There were fish kills, there were human health issues, and tourism plummeted in some of those coastal communities. Motels closed, restaurants closed, property valuations declined, county property taxes revenues, decreased. So I'm hoping that we have a way of being vigilant to make sure that we don't have significant harmful algal bloom problems, here in the Commonwealth, and that we can get ahead of problems before they become serious, rather than trying to catch up with them after the fact. I was wondering if you comment on that.
Yeah, another good question and observation. Certainly coastal waters and tidal waters, primarily we're talking about freshwater systems this afternoon. The tidal waters and estuarine waters have had a number of concerns, and some of you might remember Fisteria from a number of years back. But in freshwater systems, in the HABs, the harmful algal blooms, while different from the criteria and the amendments put before us today, still in the category of algae or cyanotoxins, right? And so not specifically what we're looking at, but not separable either. The response monitoring program that I mentioned before, we have identified areas of concern, let's say, and a few of these areas of concern where there are VDH swimming advisories that have been posted as a follow-up to the information that has been collected. We consider those advisories, and we consider them in our assessment process and for impairment listings. We will be having several impairments identified as a result of HABs and harmful algal blooms in the Commonwealth. We currently have closed the comment period on our 2022 integrated report, so we do have some waters that have been identified. And I would say specifically two of the water bodies of concern. One that will have an impairment identified is Lake Anna. The other does not have an impairment in its near future, but certainly concerns have been raised based on a HAB advisory from last summer, is the Shenandoah River system, or the river basin, particularly the North Fork of the Shenandoah River. We do have a charge from the General Assembly this year and have been provided funds to study HABs in those two water bodies specifically. So we are in the process of developing study plans for those projects. Those projects, one is in a riverine reservoir, or one is in a riverine system, the Shenandoah River Basin. One is an impoundment or a reservoir with Lake Anna. And we would anticipate that the information we learn from these studies will be transferable to other systems in Virginia. So we do have a lot going on the topic of HABs, and there's a lot of work going on. But again, related but separate from the amendments before us today.
Thank you for that.
Any more questions?
I have one quick question. What issues are there of approving this before we get the comments back from the AG's office?
I am going to look for Melissa to make sure if I stray on my response here, I don't think it's uncommon to approve these amendments contingent, well, with the AG approval not yet in place. But the procedural question, I don't want to answer it incorrectly, so I'm going to ask Melissa to weigh in.
I apologize. I didn't have them set a mic for me over here today. I forgot. The Attorney General's office has been provided with this information. In our normal processes, once you do take a final action, they do upload onto the Town Hall website their certification. But Mr. Jagels, if you want to speak to.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So once it's approved by the board, we'll review it once more. And if there are any issues, we'll certainly come back to the board. But we expect that this will be approved and certified.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I think we're good. Recommendation, please. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Just wanted to let you know, we do have a couple speakers that did comment during the public comment forum that have 3 minutes to address the board. The first one is David Sly with Wild Virginia.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if I can talk clearly enough with this thing on, but thanks for the chance to talk to you today. There's a lot of documentation in the record before you for this action that we'd like to call to your attention, some of it about water quality problems that exist now and some that have existed for quite some time. I'll give you 2 examples that we think are symptomatic of some other things. First, there's a paper plant discharge in Amherst County that causes a black plume in the James River that is so clear, so large, that you can see it in the satellite photos on Google Earth. Now, I can tell you that that discharge has existed in highly colored form since early 1980s because I inspected it on behalf of this board as an agency employee. The second instance has to do with problems with plants and algal matter. And you've heard a lot about that. Frankly, we respect and agree with a lot of what the staff has done in relation to the filamentous attached algae. What I'm talking about is some other problems that are implicated under the narrative criteria, and that is that through the years, for at least 15 years, there have been many dozens of complaints from the public about noxious conditions from the odor and the appearance of rotting algae and plants. Even your supervisor of the field inspection group in the Valley office reported that it looks and smells like sewage. He called it nasty. We think those kinds of circumstances and others that they're symptomatic of clearly violate the narrative criteria that now exist and have existed for more than 50 years, by the way. That's why Wild Virginia and 7 other groups proposed some specific language for the regulation that we think would more specifically ensure that when regulatory actions happen, they'll address these kinds of problems. Now, DEQ's answer was, we do address narrative criteria in a number of ways, and they're right. We never tried to deny that. And in fact, I think some of them are very effective. But they didn't answer how they affect these specific kinds of problems. And we think that's their duty, and we think you should demand it. So what we're asking for is for you to get that kind of explanation. We've looked at the record. We did FOIAs. We didn't just look at what they provided with you. We looked at everything we could find. There's no analysis there. There's no explanation there as to how these kinds of problems are handled. So we're asking you to get that information and not to approve these standards until you get it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Sloan?
The second speaker that is signed up is Patrick Fanning, Chesapeake Bay Foundation. 3 minutes.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the board. Patrick Fanning, Virginia staff attorney for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Mostly just wanted to start off by thanking the DEQ staff. As you heard, we were members of the regulatory advisory panel, and it's a challenging time to be going through a process like that. And we first just commend DEQ staff for their efforts. And as a member of the RAP, we really appreciate that. And also the way that they dealt with what is a really challenging issue related to the filamentous algae criteria, taking something that could be subjective, am I willing to go kayaking in the Shenandoah River when there's so much algae, and creating something that's scientifically defensible and objective. So it took a long time, as you heard, 10 years or so in the making, but we think what's on the books now is going to be really helpful and effective to again, addressing the recreational use. And in particular, we were encouraged to see that DEQ will consider using that same approach for other non-tidal water segments once there's sufficient data available. We know that recreational use impairment doesn't just exist on the Shenandoah River, so we look forward to developing those criteria for other segments. We also want to commend DEQ and the board for considering updating the submerged aquatic vegetation criteria to be consistent with the Chesapeake Bay program. And finally, we hope that DEQ will turn back to the turbidity water quality criteria, especially now that this triennial review process is wrapping up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No more comments. Mr. Thomas? You ready for staff recommendation?
Ready for the recommendation? Okay.
Yes, sir.
The staff recommendation is to adopt the amendments to the Water Quality Standards Regulation 9 VAC 25-260 for triennial review as presented today.
I'll entertain a motion. Staff recommendation.
I so move, Madam Chairman.
Second.
Have a motion and a second. Further discussion? Hearing none, I'll call for the vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're having a good time with those microphones, aren't we? All right, Ms. Porterfield, do you suggest we take a break or keep going? All right. Board, are you guys okay with that?
Yes, ma'am.
Hearing no objections, we're moving on. All right, tab N, proposed regulations. Mr. Sherman.
Good morning. I'm Peter Sherman with the Office of VIPTES Permits. I'm presenting proposed amendments for the VIPTES general permit.
Microphone.
I'm presenting proposed amendments to the VIPTES general permit regulation for discharges resulting from the application of pesticides to surface waters, 9 VAC 25-800. Next slide, please. This general permit is applicable to operators who discharge from surface waters from the application of biological pesticides or chemical pesticides that leave a residue for any of 5 specified use patterns, including the treatment of mosquitoes or flying insects, weed or algae, animal pests, forest canopy pests, or intrusive vegetation. This general permit follows the framework of US EPA's Pesticide General Permit, which was most recently reissued in 2021. The provisions are also coordinated with Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services pesticide regulations, which exist at 2 VAC 5-670 through 690. The technology-based effluent limits in the general permit require that operators minimize pesticide discharges to surface waters via the use of integrated pest management principles. Visual monitoring is required under the permit, and reporting is required of any adverse impacts, such as fish kills. And the permit requires that a pesticide discharge management plan must be prepared for applications that exceed specified thresholds. Next slide, please. With regard to process, the general permit expires February 29, 2024. A notice of intended regulatory action was published September 27, 2021. No comments were received on the response to the NOIRA. One TAC meeting was held on April 15, 2022. The TAC did not identify any major issues and supported the revisions being proposed. And on August 11th this year, EPA Region 3 indicated they had no comments on the proposed general permit and provided their concurrence. Next slide, please. Minimal changes to the general permit are being proposed. We're proposing to add a definition of pesticide discharge. This language is from EPA's 2021 pesticide general permit and clarifies that such discharges do not include agricultural stormwater discharges or return flows from irrigated agriculture. We're also proposing to clarify the definition of pesticide residue. This language is also from EPA's pesticide general permit, and it helps clarify when this permit is applicable. As previously discussed, a new definition of board has been added to the permit. Within the body of the permit, we're proposing to change the term board to department wherever the language addresses a permit action. We revised the term of the general permit such that the new effective date is March 1, 2024. The new expiration date would be February 28, 2029. For animal pest control, for animal pest control, we've added cultural methods to the pest management measures that must be considered. This change also reflects language in EPA's pesticide general permit. With regard to minor changes, we're replacing some select permit language with more generic language to improve consistency among our general permits and to require fewer changes during future reissuances. We've also updated the web links for the endangered and threatened species information and non-compliance reporting provisions in the permit and updated our regional office addresses. I would also note that in response to a comment from the board on our board book materials, we've edited the reissuance year and the fact sheet. Are there any questions?
Any questions from the board? Hearing none, proceed, please.
Next slide, please. The staff recommends that the board authorize a public comment period and public hearing for amendments to the general permit regulation for discharges resulting from the application of pesticides to surface waters. Staff also recommends that the board authorize DEQ staff to serve as the hearing officer at the public hearing.
I'll entertain a motion for staff recommendation.
Madam Chairman, I move we approve the staff recommendation.
I have a motion. I need a second.
Second.
Have a second. Any further discussion from the board? Hearing none. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have on our list other business, future meeting dates. Ms. Porterfield.
Yes, right now, the future meeting date of the State Water Control Board is November 29th, 2022. I will be emailing the board now that we have Mr. Kilgore as a new member and we have 7 members again. I will be looking to start setting up meetings for early 2023. So we try to meet quarterly, so we're probably looking at trying to at least establish the next, or at least the first or second meeting of the board for 2023 as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Division Director report, Ms. Davenport.
Madam Chairman, thank you very much. My PowerPoint is being passed out. We have been very busy in water permitting, addressing some issues that we knew needed to be taken care of regarding stormwater. For those of you who were not on the board in 2013, these programs had been housed at the Department of Conservation and Recreation, which is a sister agency. The General Assembly moved them back to DEQ, and this board adopted a number of regulations regarding both erosion and sediment control and post-construction stormwater quantity and quality. You also became the proud owners of the construction general permit, of the MS4 or municipal separate storm sewer system permit. And we have been talking to you on and off over the years about a number of these stormwater programs. I think it's fair to say that when the programs first came to DEQ, there were two issues. One, the staff at DCR had not, well, let's back up. There was a regulation that DCR adopted in 2011 that came to DEQ in 2013 and then became effective in 2014. So that was kind of a very unusual way to address a regulatory rulemaking. And because of that transition and because of some staff challenges at DCR, it came over without a lot of technical guidance and direction for the regulated community to understand what was going on. The other thing is that the programs came over with less than half the staff that we felt we needed to actually implement the programs. So my folks in the stormwater program have been working really hard over the years to make this program work. But when our new director was appointed, Mr. Rolban has a lot of experience in stormwater and erosion and sediment control and permitting. And he said, you know, I have a bunch of ideas that will improve this program. So we really worked to, Drew Hammond, I don't know how many of you remember Drew, he runs a lot of our permitting programs. Drew was given a special assignment. And we have a number of exciting things in place, which hopefully will not only improve the stormwater program, but will also relieve some of the stress on us as the staff. Because a lot of what we do is case by case. A lot of it is very technical and engineering derived. So I'm going to tell you about a couple of the things that we have working in stormwater. And then the other thing that we'll talk about, I'm sure you've heard there is a proliferation of industrial scale solar that's going on in Virginia. And there have been a number of issues related to that land use change and what's going on with stormwater and E&S. So some of that's been embedded, and I'm going to walk through that, and then happy to answer any questions if you have them. So the problem, next slide, please. I can't read this tape measure very well, Mike. Is it 27 inches? 23 inches. One of the challenges that the program has had is that its regulations, its manuals, its guidance documents, and its technical bulletins are massive, almost 2 feet worth of paper. Some of those manuals date back to the 1990s, and they offer this overwhelming amount of information about how to implement erosion and sediment control and post-construction stormwater quality. But it's really kind of a peck through this, pick and choose, see if the state's addressed your issue. Have they addressed it clearly? Have they addressed it in a way that you as a design professional can understand exactly what we're saying? And the fact of the matter is, in most instances, the answer is no, which is why there's so much back and forth as we work through these programs. So next slide, please. We are implementing a multi-pronged solution to the issue of stormwater. And these are not in any particular order, but the first thing we're doing is we are We've gone out for requests for proposals for consultants, engineers, consortiums to help us take all that almost 2 feet of information and turn it into a new stormwater handbook that is a living document. So what are the things in that pile that have been superseded? What are the things in the pile that we should take another look at? A lot of our best management practices, design specs are 20, 30, maybe even 40 years old. So we're really working hard to bring all that information current. That 24 inches, almost 2 feet of information was also not on the DEQ website. They were kind of sprinkled all over the place. We had a number of things on the BMP clearinghouse that Virginia Tech maintains for us. So we have actually gotten all those documents uploaded to the website, and they are there. We're also working on the development of 3 guidance documents. One is a design guide. It's about close to 60 pages of kind of a how-to for a number of these issues. What do the regs say? What is a design professional expected to do? And it is a guidance document such that it doesn't say you must, because as I mentioned, there's still a lot of best professional judgment in the application of E&S and stormwater. But it does say, if you do these things, it will lead you on the path of quick and easy DEQ approval. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about these as I go through it. The next one is a streamlined review process, which puts some responsibility back on the design community, and we'll talk about that. Both of those 2 documents are out for public comment right now, and the comment period concludes at the end of this month. And then the 3rd guidance document that we're going to work on once we get these 2 is guidance on agribusiness. There's some really difficult, conflicting information in the statutes and regs about what applies to agricultural activity and silvicultural activity, so we're going to work through all of that and hopefully provide some clarity. The other thing that's interesting that I failed to mention is that both of these programs, E&S is almost exclusively handled by local erosion and sediment control authorities. Stormwater, our larger localities have to have a program, smaller ones have an opportunity to opt in, and they're always asking DEQ for technical guidance because they have a hard time getting through that almost 2 feet of technical information. So this will help both what we approve at the state level and our partners at the local level. The VRRM is the Virginia Runoff Reduction Method, which is post-2014. It is our criteria for evaluating stormwater runoff. That was developed in that 2011, 2013, 2014 timeframe. It needs to be updated. There are assumptions in there that we pulled from some of the Chesapeake Bay modeling. We need to bring that current, and there is an update in process. We are going to actually utilize some outside contractor resources to help us do that, and that's currently in procurement. And then one of the really challenging things is recruiting staff. We have so many vacancies. We continue to have so many vacancies in this program. So we have had a continuous recruit out for the last couple months, specifically for folks who can review stormwater and E&S plans. But as you might imagine, as folks become skilled in this, they're quite a valuable commodity for the engineering and consulting world. And a lot of cases, we can't afford to compete with the salaries that are paid in the private sector. So we're working on all these things. I believe the director is starting to hear that there are things that are going well. Next slide, please. So just to spend a moment about these 2 draft guidance documents that are at public comment. The first one I mentioned, I call it the design guide. And that is that really technical document about kind of dissecting all the requirements and the regulations and saying, if you do this, if you do that, if you consider this. And again, it's a suggestion, and it is a path forward for rapid plan review. The second guidance memo is designed to address the chronic challenge we have with plans that are submitted that are not up to snuff. They don't meet the technical requirements. In some instances, it could be that the design engineers disagree with DEQ's interpretation of regulations. We think a big problem is that the way the stormwater regulations are set up, you as a third party, you as a non-government person, can submit a plan without having had to have any training or certification about what our rules mean. In other words, there's a default to, if you're a PE, what does the scope of your professional license say? And then, yes, you can submit those designed engineered plans, landscape architects, so we didn't create a separate certification or continuing education requirement. Next slide, please. Oh, I missed that slide. I'm sorry. I'm so excited about all this. I kind of got a step ahead of me. Can you go one more, please? Oh, no, go back. All right, I'm going to stop and start again. I apologize that I was going to talk about the stormwater guidance, the design manual first. So let's do that. And as this slide shows, it does articulate in one document where a plan set shall include. It hits the common deficiencies. Surprisingly, we never had a plan submission checklist before, so it provides a very explicit checklist so that we can tell up front whether a plan set is complete or not complete. And we were going to develop a separate guidance on plans related to solar, but we decided to incorporate that into this document. And I'm going to talk a minute about that. Next, please. So there's been a lot of conversation lately, and DEQ is actually hosting a very large legislative work group to talk about solar development and its impact or possible potential impact on prime agriculture and forested lands. And we have a program at DEQ, I think it's called Bright Fields, is that the right terminology?
That was the conference. That was the conference. It's brownfields.
Well, it's brownfields, but
if you
it is...
bright fields, you put solar on it.
Right. It is the notion that we should be encouraging solar development on brownfield sites, and particularly on some of the former mining sites in Southwest Virginia. So what this guidance, in furtherance of that effort, this guidance proposes to redefine. So there's a difference in your post-construction stormwater obligations if you're a greenfield site or redevelopment. So we are proposing to define brownfield and reclaimed coalfield solar projects as redevelopment, which means your water quality reduction goes down to a 20% pre and post. So again, we're trying to encourage, that's a good land use activity for those sites, and this guidance proposes a means to get there. Next, please. You may have heard about this. The guidance also proposes addressing the solar arrays themselves, the panels, as unconnected, impervious. I think it's fair to say that when we started to see these solar projects, these solar farms, we made some decisions based on sort of how they were being built, and the industry has changed significantly since we saw our first plans. So as you can see, a field full of solar panels looks a lot more like impervious than it does pervious, because they're very solid surfaces. So what we are suggesting is that we will consider solar panel arrays as unconnected impervious. Next slide, please. And this is just, if you are not a student of stormwater, you can see that 1 inch of rainfall on an acre of forest results in about 750 gallons of runoff. whereas an inch of rain on an acre of pavement results in about 27,000 gallons of runoff. So we are seriously changing the hydrology with the installation of all these solar panels. Next, please. And this is just another example. You know, I think that if you haven't seen these sites, you might not realize what goes on. But as you can see, the precipitation hitting a solar panel looks an awful lot like precipitation hitting the roof of a building. And the problem is, we've also discovered that there's an awful lot of grading and compaction that goes on as these sites are set up for construction activity. So the idea, you know, we had kind of been working on the idea that we had a lot of vegetated cover under the panels and that there would be some absorption, but, you know, we have learned over time that that's not necessarily the case. And then these are just a couple pictures of current solar farms. And as you can see, even though the intent is to have vegetated growth among and between the panels, sometimes that's kind of hard to achieve. So they don't look like meadows and lawns anymore. Next slide, please. We propose two things in the guidance. One is a technical solution and one is a timing issue. And for a technical solution, we are suggesting that if a project owner, there's technology out there where you can put rain sensors on the panels such that when it rains, they go from horizontal to vertical, which means you've eliminated a lot of that impervious and unconnected impervious cover. So what we say in this guidance is that if a project owner elects to implement this rain sensing technology, that the horizontal project area may be assumed to be zero. So we're encouraging this technology. We think it's a win for us and it's a win for the solar developers. And in that case, we still would look at the supports, the columns, the beams. They would be considered impervious, but it's a much smaller fraction of the site. And we are now seeing in Charlotte County, for example, sites that are 1,000 to 3,000 acres of panels. So if they install this technology, their post-construction stormwater requirements are going to be significantly reduced. So we're hoping that developers take advantage of this. Next slide, 2. The other thing that we deal with in the guidance is when does this determination of solar panels as unconnected impervious kick in? And this became a very contentious issue because we really wanted to say, you know, as of today, this is how DEQ is going to consider the farms. But we had a lot of input from the solar lobby, from Dominion, which ultimately ends up owning a number of these projects. And we realized that oftentimes by the time a facility is designing stormwater, they've really invested an awful lot, both in site design and also through the PJM process, and that's the Regional Transmission Organization. And there were issues about a project's obligation to PJM to deliver a certain amount of electricity. So what we're trying to do is find at what point in that process is it equitable to say from now on you have to design your stormwater as controls as if it were impervious. And I think we offer two choices. We offer a firm date of 4/14/22. So if you had a new service request in by that moment in time, you were allowed to utilize our previous guidance. Another option is a little harder to implement because it talks about a future date, and that's what's called the Dominion suggestion up there, that December 31st, 2024. So if you are in between, if you have conducted your feasibility and impact studies for PJM by that date, we're not going to trigger the impervious cover. We felt like some folks thought, you know, that kind of puts them in a race to get that work done before that date, and other folks might want to stick with the firm date of 4/14/22. But again, it's out for public comment, and we will be getting comments, and hopefully we will have offered a couple options as to when these impervious requirements kick in. Okay, next page. Again, that is a picture of a farm, a solar array that is up and operating. And again, you can see that there's an awful lot of bare earth among and between the arrays, and that is something that we're really hoping to drive towards correction with this new guidance document. Okay, next one, please. This is where I got distracted. I apologize. The second guidance document is offering streamlined plan review for owners and developers. And basically what this does is it is encouraging and incentivizing folks who are developing plans under a professional engineering license, a landscape architect license, to add into that review a certification by what's called a dual combined administrator. So this world of certifications exists because, as I mentioned, these programs are state programs that are often implemented by localities. So if you're a locality who's going to implement a stormwater program, you have to have staff who are certified to review plans, conduct inspections, and administer a program. And since there's two separate programs, erosion and sediment control and stormwater, what we're saying is if your plans are reviewed by somebody who has all 6 certifications from DEQ, it's the dual combined administrator, then we are going to put that plan in line for streamlined plan review. We have built into it the opportunity for us to conduct risk-based audits of those plans. If we're concerned about the location or something about the project, or perhaps the scope of the project, or the kinds of soil that are being impacted on the site, we can take this 60-day plan period to do an audit, and if not, once you've got your 15-day completeness check and the plan sits for 60 days and we don't trigger the audit, it's considered approved. We're also suggesting that there are penalties for folks who don't follow the rules and don't address the specificity that we're asking for. So currently, as the proposed guidance is drafted, if you are someone who has who submits 5 plans and don't meet the checklist, which is the same checklist which is in the technical guidance, we are going to take another look at your certifications. And then also if you have, when we do an audit and we find 3 plans that don't reach the level of approval by us, again, we're going to go back and look. So we're really hoping this encourages folks to submit really good plans the first time and complete plans the first time. And if we are successful in achieving this cultural change, I think we'll see real relief at our level and we'll see improved plans. So those are the 2 big things that we are working on guidance. Next page is just some information. It basically, those 6 classes we talked about, it's about 95 hours of training. It's almost $1,500 in fees. And as you can see from those numbers, most of the folks who currently hold that dual combined administrator certification are from somewhere in government. 120 are for private consulting. I mean, theoretically, we would hope that every engineering firm, every developer that submits plans to us has folks on staff that have those certifications. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is some of you might remember, next slide please, that we initiated a regulation consolidation of stormwater and erosion sediment control. We worked with the stakeholder group back in the 2015 timeframe to make some changes to the legislation that we hoped would simplify the world of erosion and stormwater control. Those changed, the legislative changes happened, and then we were asked to convene a regulatory advisory panel to take those legislative changes and turn them into revised regulations. We started that effort back in 2016, and because of the workload and staff challenges, we pretty much had it on hold for several years. And we got a draft. We went back to the RAP in July of this year. We've had a second meeting. Our goal is to complete the RAP by the end of '22. This is a slightly truncated administrative process act in that the statute says we have to draft a regulation, we put it out for 60 days, public comment, and then we bring it to you as final. So it won't be the proposed go out to notice and comment, but our intent is to get a final proposed consolidated regulation at your first meeting in 2023. And again, we expect to see a significant reduction in regulatory pages, a reorganization, reducing confusion and conflicting regulatory requirements, and it was really hard to get through the regulation and understand what you had to do. Were you a developer? Were you a locality? Were you somebody who had to apply for the construction general permit? And this is also going to get tied back into the new manual. So hopefully we will have a very nice, tidy package of great stormwater improvements. And I'm happy to answer any questions, but we just wanted you to know that all this is going on.
Wow. Any questions?
I have one question. Oh, thank you. I'm just curious, I've seen some demonstration of solar and pollinator habitat, so I was just curious, maybe in practice right now, these areas are largely unvegetated, but if the developers were able to find plants that could persist in that
They're not supposed to be unvegetated.
Okay.
And we do, so DEQ also has something called we have a number of non-renewable permit by rules, which are designed for permitting smaller sites. So the bigger generation facilities still go through the State Corporation Commission, but for this is 150 megawatts. I always forget the threshold because another division actually administers them. But we have worked with Department of Wildlife Resources and Department of Conservation and Recreation to encourage pollinator species to be planted. I don't know. We think a large problem with the revegetation is the compaction and the lack of topsoil. So that's what we're asking folks to do again in this guidance document. Mike, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, so DEQ does have a solar pollinator program. It's voluntary. We can't require it, but and theoretically, the native plants will have deeper root systems and reduce runoff over time. Yeah. It takes 2 to 3 years to get them established, so it takes time. The biggest problem we're seeing is in the initial phase of the project, when the panels are up and you have compacted bare soil, and then even then when you get the plants growing. So over time, that will help. And some solar developers are doing that voluntary. Some are doing it through local zoning requirements or special use permit requirements. But the biggest problem is what Melanie just said is, in this area, because of the terrain and because of the tracker technology that was being used, they're trying to basically flatten the sites, and it costs more money to strip the topsoil and put it back and decompact, so it's just cut to fill and compacted. So all the things that are in our guidance, we're trying to encourage better practices. So a lot of like the Great Plains Initiative and their modeling, it's all assuming that you didn't compact the site, right, or you decompacted and you left the topsoil on top. And now the newer tracker technologies that are coming out can handle more undulating terrain, so that hopefully will help. And then if people want to use rain sensors, most of the on-the-market stuff is 52 to 60 degrees, being able to tilt. You could potentially make it tilt more to reduce runoff. So there's all these things together. We're just providing tools that they can use to reduce the impact on the aquatic environment from the solar. We know solar is good,
right,
but it's not good to destroy downstream, benthics and to flood people downstream.
So true, absolutely. All right, thank you.
I have a question. I don't know what I'm talking about at all, but I've read some stuff, and I understand you can't believe everything you read. But I've read where some of these solar panel areas where solar panels have gotten damaged and rain, we get groundwater contamination. Is that true? And if that's true, what are we doing about it?
I am not aware of any documented groundwater contamination related to a solar farm.
I'll say
I'm looking around to see if anybody else at
I've had
DEQ.
numerous emails about this, and I've talked to one of the professors at Virginia Tech, and so far I'm being told that it's not happening. You know, in terms of the runoff on the panels themselves, you know, the water quality is not. There's no significant change from heavy metals from the panels. You know, there is, you know, some other nutrient issues that we're regulating. That's a hot topic that has to get studied more.
Okay.
And we're proposing to use some of our money, I don't have it approved yet, to potentially do a contract with Virginia Tech to do actual on-site quantity and quality monitoring to find out. But so far, all the emails and articles I've seen, it needs an acidic environment to leach out the bad metals, and we don't have that in our rainwater right now.
Okay, but what I'd read, it was not the panels as they existed, but when they become damaged, then that becomes the issue.
Right. So if you do crush the metal and expose it to a more acidic environment, you can get a leachate of bad chemicals.
Okay.
But most of the damage that we've heard about, it's hail and bird strike. It's not
Catastrophic.
Right.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Mr. Cameron.
Yeah, thank you very much, Madam Chairman. And Melissa, really appreciate Melanie, the presentation. I share, I think, the staff's and probably the director's concern about the water quality and other environmental impact from solar development. A month or so ago, I had an opportunity to talk to a Virginia State forester about his perspective. And I've long since learned not to paraphrase people, so he sent me an email what his perspective is on this. And he said that Virginia Department of Forestry recognizes forest conversion to development as one of the threats to the forest resource, and that utility-scale solar development is causing significant forest conversion in Virginia. So, you know, I would argue that we have broader concerns than water quality. We've got natural resource impacts. We have potential wildlife impacts if we're losing forest or grassland habitat. And to me personally, it's kind of ironic that we're cutting down trees that store carbon in order to build solar farms to avoid using fossil fuels, a form of electricity. So I just wanted to make that point. Driving south from Fairfax, I passed Potomac Mills today, and there have got to be hundreds, if not thousands, of acres of parking lots in Prince William County at Potomac Mills. And I'm wondering why the General Assembly might not encourage solar development on brownfields and already developed commercial areas, as opposed to clear-cutting forests and converting cropland to solar farms. I'm also aware of that the half a dozen soil and water conservation districts that make up Area 2 of the Virginia Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts is concerned about the impact upon the Commonwealth generally of loss of cropland and forest land for solar development. So I'm very glad to see that DEQ is paying attention to this issue. The road to hell is often paved with good intentions, and I think the General Assembly had some really good intentions a couple of years ago. but I think it's useful to reflect on what the second and third order consequences, might be of those good intentions. Thank you.
I'll just so you know, so we have another division, the Air and Renewable Energy Division, and they're not here today, but the General Assembly tasked us under House Bill 206 to facilitate a stakeholders advisory group to look at the impact on large-scale solar farms, on agricultural farms, not solar farms, and forest. And we have 80-something people involved, I think 50-something.
We were in this
room
on Tuesday.
Right. So we've had 4 meetings already. We're winding that study down, or that group down, and they're trying to come to some sort of consensus. What happened in the General Assembly, they could never reach consensus on the exact, if you build solar on a farm, you can't use it for much agricultural activity. You can do some things, but sheep, goats are not good, they jump up on the panels. If you put it in a forest, if you want to retain the value of the forest, you have to plant the trees somewhere, and the only place to plant the trees are in a field that is farmed. So it's a real conundrum. That group is trying to come up with recommendations. At the General Assembly, they could not reach a consensus. And I know there's at least 2 people who are involved in that fight. In the audience, I see them. So Delegate Wiebert proposed this study group instead. This report will go back to the General Assembly. So this next session is probably a potential time where it'll be discussed a lot. There are a whole bunch of groups that contact. The most number of emails I get and calls per day is about stormwater. The second most is solar. And it's amazing. I mean, the Bristol landfill isn't even that popular. But there are a lot of groups that are talking about why not rooftop. And some of you can Google me, and I put a rooftop on my old office building over a decade ago. And for a brief period, it was the largest solar facility in Virginia. But there are rooftops, there are parking lots. It's a cost issue. So, if the economics were incentivized to allow that to be more economical, the market would probably respond, but DEQ can't do that. The only little thing I had in my power was to propose a redefinition of a brownfield and a reclaimed coal field to try to at least encourage that. We'll see what the public comment says. Not everybody, will agree probably.
I can add 1 or 2 comments, or I can stop talking, whatever the preference is. One of the things that the work group is looking at is actually defining what is prime agricultural land, and there's another work group that's working on building a map to do that. I think that the other thing that we can't forget is that the localities that are hosting these farms have that authority under their local zoning. So, to the extent that folks might say to DEQ, well, how are you allowing this? How are you supporting it? Why here? Why there? We have to remember that these are all initiated by local zoning decisions, and both VACO and a number of localities are participating in that work group. So, I'm not surprised that a consensus didn't get reached in the, 60 or 45 days of last session, but we'll see what happens. And DEQ serves as a subject matter expert. We are not a participant, but I walk around and say, hey, any questions about stormwater, hydrology, anything like that, mitigation, so.
One more, if you don't mind. The dual combined administrator, is our soil and waters, are they stepping up to the plate for that? For our small local governments?
Well, I mean, they do serve in the role for a number of localities because there is still that option on E&S. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that when the legislation passed to offer an opt-out option for small localities, one of the reasons behind that was why should we stand up a program? Because we don't have any development. If we need to issue 1 or 2 construction general permits in the course of a year, does it make sense to invest in this local stormwater program? And we agreed. Now what we're seeing, though, is because, not surprisingly, a lot of these larger farms are in rural areas, we as DEQ serve as the VSMP authority. So we are the ones responsible for reviewing and approving the plans. So there really is no connection back. And then there was even legislation passed last year that allows these opt-out localities to ask DEQ to review the E&S plans as well as the stormwater plans for these solar sites. So we do a lot of work, and the districts don't work, for us as they would for a locality.
Thank you.
Okay.
I think we've questioned you out. All right, I think you're up next, aren't you?
I am. Thank you.
I'm going to recuse myself, and you can call me back.
Sure. So as I reported at the June meeting, Mountain Valley Pipeline does still lack approvals to work in the National Forest and to cross wetlands and streams. However, Mountain Valley is and the issue that I explained, which I can tell you again, is that Mountain Valley applied for an individual permit to cross wetlands and streams, and they applied to the Corps for that permit. Well, since the project is certificated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the Corps kind of uses that environmental impact statement to support the decisions that they make on the permitting. And the Fourth Circuit has heard at least twice about the adequacy of the biological opinion that Fish and Wildlife provided in the context of FERC. So that is continuing litigation, and Mountain Valley is working with Fish and Wildlife to develop a supplemental biological opinion. And once that's done, and the Fourth Circuit says, okay, it's sufficient, then the Corps will be able to utilize that biological opinion to move forward in its evaluation of the wetland and stream crossing permit. So the Corps permit is still on hold. But my understanding is that there is conversation back and forth to revise the supplemental biological opinion. The other issue that you may have seen in the press is that FERC issued its authorization to construct the pipeline for X amount of time. And just on Tuesday, they issued an order granting Mountain Valley's request for an extension of time to complete the construction. They have been given until October of 2026 to complete the construction. And that was an issue that generated quite a lot of conversation. We will continue to focus on maintenance and stabilization efforts because unless the Corps' 404 permit is issued to cross wetlands and streams, there is no forward construction. So really what's going on site is inspections and then maintenance of temporary stabilization practices. We had 3 items since I reported to you in June that came in as complaints to our pollution response program, and they involve sediment tracking on the road, standing water on the right-of-way, and stormwater discharges. As always, we went out and investigated, and those situations were not found to be related to any noncompliance on the part of the pipeline. So that's it for my report.
Quick question. What authority, given the board bill, does this board have now with the Mountain Valley Pipeline? Do we have anything left?
As I think I have said before, I do not represent a lawyer in this situation, but based on our reading of the board bill, the board's authority with 657 is limited to the promulgation of regulations. So I would say no, but I'm also looking to Mike. You don't have any authority.
Right. And I probably understand why this is on the agenda, but is there a need in the future for this to be on the agenda for an update if we don't have authority?
Great question. Who's going to answer that one?
I will,
I mean, I guess that's a board decision.
right,
So I'm
and-
asking my fellow board members.
it was a suggestion by a previous board member, Tim
Right.
Hayes, and we have just met his request. So I guess you're right.
I mean, it's not a long presentation, so I will withdraw that question and allow it, and we can reconsider it at the next meeting. Because your report is short. It's not like it's continuing my time up here.
Great question, though. Okay,
And
thank
I
you.
believe I am finished.
I
Thank
think-
you.
Do we have some public comments?
Yes, we have one individual that's registered to speak during the public forum. It's Jessica Sims, representing Appalachian Voices, and she'd like to speak about gold mining. She has 3 minutes.
Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon to all of you. Again, Jessica Sims representing Appalachian Voices. Some of this is repeated information, but welcome to the newer members and returning members. But want to flag for y'all a potential threat to Virginia's watersheds and ways in which y'all can learn more and participate on the issue. A number of years ago, a Canadian prospecting company came to Buckingham County and began exploratory drilling for gold mining without any knowledge of the county or consent from the surrounding neighbors of the impacted area. So Buckingham has been targeted owing to its previous gold mining industry, but what they are hoping to bring to Virginia is unprecedented for the Commonwealth. It would be large-scale metal mining, and they're not limiting that exploration to gold. They're also pursuing copper, zinc, and lead in Pittsylvania and Campbell counties. And the concern about this, or for any location along the belt which runs from Fairfax to Halifax, is that we do not have a regulatory framework for the industry at that scale. Additionally, we do not have a bonding structure that would be sufficient to keep those counties safe. We are already blighted with lots of unreclaimed gold mines, some of which are leaking mercury into the Rapidan. And the lack of regulatory oversight for this issue would make a situation susceptible to bad actors. So just very concerned about what this impact could be to drinking water, specifically to the James River watershed, since it is the largest tributary to the Chesapeake. It brings 6 million visitors into the Commonwealth each year and is the drinking water for 2.7 million people. So flagging that for y'all because there's an ongoing study right now of the impacts. It closes on September 30th. There's a state agency committee that's reviewing that. And I would encourage y'all to consider inviting Mike Skivington from the Virginia Department of Energy to your next meeting to maybe talk about this issue and let you know what the latest is on that. There is a National Academy of Sciences study that's just finished their kind of review period, and that with the state agency committee are going to produce a report that will be available by December 1st to the public and members of the General Assembly. So just want to flag that for y'all. You can visit the DOE site, and it has information on that. And then to speak to what Member Kilgore just brought up, it might be to the board's benefit to hear from members of the public on the subject, which I won't mention, just because it is an issue that remains of significant concern, and the best available from those living those experiences might be helpful for y'all to understand how it could impact the regulatory process. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Sims. Is there anything else to come before the board at this time? No more? All right. We have our meeting date settled for November, and at this time I will adjourn the meeting of the State Water Control Board. Thank you guys for coming. We're